The desert stretched beneath an indifferent sky, a vast and shifting plain of red and dun-colored grains that blurred the boundary between land and time. Nothing grew here, nothing settled, nothing stayed where it chose to be. The wind carved lines across the dunes only to erase them with the next uneven breath, creating patterns that seemed deliberate one moment and meaningless the next. The horizon wavered like a half-forgotten memory, never stable enough for certainty. Only the sorcerer's steps provided any temporary anchor to the world, and even these sank into the sand for mere moments before being swallowed whole, as if reality desired to forget him as quickly as the grains beneath his boots did. The weight of his armor pressed downward with ritualistic gravity, but the desert resisted little. Each footfall briefly sculpted the sand into intricate depressions that resembled sigils or fragments of a shattered language. Yet these shapes drifted away as soon as the wind touched them, leaving the impression that nothing he did, nothing he changed, could ever hope to remain. The sensation brought with it a familiar heaviness, the kind that coiled around the core of a mind too accustomed to seeing consequences evaporate into nothing. Above him, the sky flickered in unnatural hues that shifted without respect for the sun's position. Patches of violet shimmered along the edges of the light, bleeding into streaks of pale amber before collapsing back into a washed-out gold. No cloud drifted overhead, yet the air moved with static tension, as though an unseen storm hovered perpetually beyond mortal sight. The warp brushed the atmosphere like invisible fingers, distorting heat into thin ripples that curled and uncurled around distant dunes. Behind the sorcerer, the dust marines advanced in complete silence. Their steps did not disturb the ground. No imprint formed beneath them. No shift of sand marked their passing. They walked with the symmetry of hollow statues, armor intact but empty, their forms held upright by lingering scraps of arcane binding. Their presence was less that of soldiers and more that of walking relics, echoes of a legion that had been reduced to its shadows. The warp clung to them with a faint shimmer, making their outlines fluctuate in the corners of perception like mirages birthed from a fevered mind. No breath escaped their armor vents, no flicker of light touched the eye lenses, no animating will stirred within them. They followed only because the spellwork of a different era had anchored them to obedience, their hollow state making them indistinguishable from the desert's own forgotten dead. Yet, despite their emptiness, the air around them carried a subtle density, as if the absence of their souls weighed more heavily than their presence ever could have. The sorcerer adjusted the balance of his staff as he descended the side of a dune. The runes etched into the weapon pulsed faintly, responding to invisible currents that swirled just above the sand. Every few steps, the staff trembled with a resonance that traveled up his arm and lodged beneath the plates of his armor like a muted warning. The desert was not silent, even though it produced no audible sound. It vibrated with intent, soft at first, like a whisper brushing against the mind, then deeper, like the slow inhalation of something vast buried beneath layers of desiccated time. He paused, allowing the sensation to surge through him unabated. Beneath the dunes, something stirred, not in movement, not in emotion, but in presence. It pressed against the fabric of perception in a way reminiscent of psychic residue left behind after catastrophic failure, faint, but unmistakably deliberate. The call did not resemble the seductive lure of warp entities, nor the predatory hunger of malevolent spirits. Instead, it resembled a beckoning rooted in knowledge, a pull toward understanding etched into the bones of a long-dead civilization. The wind shifted. A current of hot air lifted thin spirals of sand that twisted upward like threads of luminous dust, only to collapse a moment later. As they fell, they traced patterns that bore near resemblance to Eldar script, though the shapes disintegrated before meaning could form. The sight stirred an unwelcome familiarity within the sorcerer. He had seen symbols behave like that before on the day the rubric had shattered what remained of his legion's unity, turning so many into hollow shells while leaving others cursed with knowledge they could not unlearn. Memories surged like a pressure shift behind the eyes, the rubric's blinding flash, the clang of falling armor, the sudden, depthless silence that followed, the weight of irreversible transformation settling upon those who remained. Even now, centuries later, the aftershock still clung to him like dust that could never be brushed off. His brothers had become the very things walking behind him, now empty, obedient, silent, bound by the same failure he now carried into this desert. The call beneath the sand intensified. This time, it struck his senses not as a vibration but as an alignment, a sudden coherence between the shifting dunes and the warp-scarred air. Something buried here recognized him, not by identity, not by allegiance, but by the shape of the flaw inscribed upon his soul. Knowledge has a way of identifying those who hunger for it, and this knowledge had waited long enough to discern the weight of his presence. A thin line broke the horizon. Hard angles rose where only dunes should have existed. The edges were too precise, resisting the desert's relentless erosion as though protected by a veil of forgotten energy. As he approached, the structure became clearer, a half-buried geometry of Eldar origin, its architecture sinking and rising with the dunes like a colossal vessel caught in the motion of a phantom sea. Carvings adorned its partially exposed surface, though many were cracked, scorched, or worn smooth by the abrasive caress of time. The Sorcerer slowed as the air thickened, each inhalation dragging like a weight across his chest. The warp swirled more intensely around him, though it did not manifest in visible distortions. Instead, it pressed inward, creating a sense of displacement, as though his physical form lagged half a second behind his psychic presence. He could feel the runes on his armor shifting, reconfiguring, testing their own boundaries. The Dust Marines continued forward without hesitation. Where the wind tore at the dunes, they remained unmoved. Where psychic pressure thickened the air, they neither slowed nor staggered. Their empty armor made no acknowledgement of the threshold they approached, even as the sand around their greaves rose in faint spirals, drawn upward by hidden currents that recognized the remnants of souls long extinguished. As the Sorcerer reached the first protruding stones of the structure, the call beneath the sand settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. It matched neither heartbeat nor breath. Instead, it mirrored the cadence of a page turning in a massive tome, slow, inevitable, weighted by meaning that demanded a measure of cost. The carvings glimmered with faint, residual luminescence, awakening in his presence like dormant runes rediscovering their purpose. He placed his hand against the surface. Heat and cold pulsed through the stone simultaneously, creating a sensation like gripping the memory of fire and ice rather than the physical elements themselves. The structure responded, shifting subtly beneath his touch. Runes glowed and rearranged, aligning into patterns recognizable just long enough to evoke comprehension before dissolving into new configurations. The desert wind died. The silence deepened. The call rose once more, no longer a whisper, no longer a suggestion, but an invitation. The sand exhaled, and the structure awakened. The structure's awakening sent a soft tremor across the sand, subtle enough that the grains merely shivered, yet profound enough that the Sorcerer felt the ripple echo through the warp bonds layered beneath his armor. It was not a physical vibration. The tremor threaded through the psychic fabric of the region, passing through him as cold recognition. The desert stilled momentarily, as though listening to something just beyond hearing. Even the wind faltered, its motion pausing mid-current before reluctantly continuing its erratic path. The Dust Marines did not react. Their motion remained steady, each armored figure advancing with the same slow precision as before. Their lack of response was not indifference but absence. They had no inner equilibrium to disrupt, no nerves to tighten, no minds to register the tremor. They merely existed in a state of perpetual completion. Hollow vessels, anchored to purpose by fragments of a spell cast long ago. Fragments that refused decay, though the souls they once held had been stripped away. As the Sorcerer stepped deeper into the shadow cast by the half-buried structure, a faint shift in the air drew his attention. The temperature lowered perceptibly, not in a physical sense, but within the psychic field. It was the chill that accompanies the awareness of unseen eyes, or the recognition that something in the environment is assessing the boundaries of one's presence. The architecture beneath the sand radiated this sensation with a quiet authority that suggested a lingering consciousness woven into its walls. The Dust Marines passed him, slipping into the gloom of the structure's exposed entrance, with the inevitability of shadows moving at dusk. Their armor absorbed the dim glow of the changing runes, swallowing the faint light until their silhouettes became indistinguishable from the stone. They moved with an eerie fluidity that defied the stiffness of their construction, propelled not by muscle but by the unseen remnants of psychic directive. Though their forms were intact, their souls were long gone, leaving only obedient stillness behind. Where they walked, they did not disturb the dust. Their gait produced no echo, no granular shift, no vibration against the floor. The silence that followed them was absolute. It was as if the air closed behind each of their movements, erasing the impression that they had ever occupied that space. The sorcerer followed, his own footfalls far louder in comparison, the faint scrape of metal on stone ricocheting through the hall with disproportionate weight. Inside, the structure revealed itself as a corridor carved from a single massive slab of unknown material. The walls curved with the elegance of Eldar design, every line and arc betraying a precision that mortal hands could not replicate. The surfaces were smooth yet intricate, alive with patterns that shifted like ripples in water under the right angle of observation. Some of the carvings glowed faintly, a light that seemed to cling to the stone rather than radiate outward. The air tasted stale, tinged with the metallic dryness of age. The atmosphere carried a faint distortion, like a memory preserved too long, its edges frayed. The corridor widened gradually, revealing a chamber where the ceiling rose high enough to disappear into shadow. The room felt oppressively large despite its silence. Not a single object stood within it, yet the emptiness seemed deliberate, as though something once filled the space and had been removed with meticulous care. The dust marines spread out, occupying positions as if expecting assault or ambush, although their incapacity to perceive threat rendered their formation merely a habitual echo. Their rifles remained locked in unchanging grips, barrels angled downward in a perpetual state of unreadiness. The sorcerer sensed the void where alertness should have been, no tension in muscle, no flicker of psychic wariness. The warriors stood as they had been left centuries ago, unmoving shadows clinging to the edges of a forgotten world. He studied them. Even in their emptiness, they bore significance. The rubric had hollowed them, leaving behind suits that mimicked life while containing none of its warmth. Beneath the plates, there was no heart, no soul, no breath, only dust, silt, and a binding that refused to loosen. Every step they took in obedience was an act rooted in the failure of the Legion, a reminder of choices made in desperation. As he moved past them, the air shifted again. This time the motion carried weight. A faint current of psychic residue drifted downward from the chamber ceiling, settling like invisible snowfall upon his shoulders and helm. It was cold, sharp, and impossibly ancient, an afterimage of knowledge that once pulsed through these halls. It left no mark, but lingered as a sensation, the awareness that something had been here long before him, long before the Legion's calamities, long before the desert claimed the surface above. The shadows in the chamber thickened as he advanced. They clung to the walls and nested in the corners, moving subtly with the faint fluctuations in psychic pressure. In the shifting dark, the dust marines appeared more statues than soldiers, their stillness merging with the architecture until they became part of the structure itself. Their armor gathered the gloom like ink-absorbing water, deepening it until they resembled void figures positioned in silent vigil. The sorcerer halted at the center of the room. The silence pressed inward with palpable mass, settling around his shoulders with the weight of expectation. Beneath the stone, he felt the pulse again, slow, heavy, measured. It resonated through the soles of his boots, climbing his legs and spreading through his torso like cold water. The pulse grew stronger with each passing moment, not sound, not movement, a presence. He extended one hand slightly, palm open, fingers relaxed. The chamber responded. The runes carved along the walls shimmered, their faint luminescence intensifying for a brief instant. Lines that had been dormant brightened along their edges, tracing complex arcs and spirals that remained only partially comprehensible. Some symbols flickered irregularly, as though uncertain whether to reveal themselves fully or retreat into the stone. The air thickened. The dust marines showed no reaction. The sorcerer felt a psychic echo sweep past him, subtle yet precise. It was not an attack. It was an assessment, a measure of his presence, his nature. the floor carved into him since the day the rubric fell upon the Legion. The echo moved through him like a thin blade, slicing water, clean, without friction, without pain, yet unmistakably invasive. The desert's call had drawn him here, and now the structure's interior was verifying the reason for his arrival. The pulse beneath the floor grew stronger. The shadows deepened. The silence sharpened. In that moment, the Dust Marines tilted slightly, not by their own will, not by instinct, but as if the force that bound them had shifted to accommodate a new configuration. Their armor creaked softly, an unnatural sound given their usual stillness, though the noise was faint enough to be mistaken for the settling of old stone. Their heads angled by a fraction, aligning toward the corridor ahead. The Sorcerer recognized the change immediately. They were being repositioned, not by command, not by threat, by the pull of the structure itself. The corridor ahead darkened further, and a faint glow, pale, thin, almost translucent, emerged at its far end. The light pulsed in rhythm with the sensation beneath the floor. It was not bright enough to reveal details, but its shift in intensity marked it as the source of whatever called to him across the sands. The Dust Marines began to move again. Their steps remained silent, their motions without weight, their presence without imprint. They advanced down the corridor in rigid formation, their armor absorbing the faint glow until it vanished entirely. The chamber returned to its heavy stillness. The Sorcerer followed, the air tightening around him as he left the chamber behind. The shadows recoiled slightly at his passage, as though reluctant to release him into the deeper darkness ahead. The call from beneath the sand was no longer distant. It was near. It was waiting, and it had recognized him. The corridor narrowed as the Sorcerer advanced, the walls bowing inward as though shaped by pressure from long-forgotten tides. The material was smooth but not polished, bearing the faint sheen of something that had once been alive with energy. Even in its dormancy, the surface of the structure shifted subtly beneath the drifting shadows, as though reacting to the intrusion of living presence after centuries of abandonment. A thin layer of dust coated the floor, but the Dust Marines left no mark upon it. Their armor passed across the ground without disturbing the particles, and not a single grain rose in protest. Only the Sorcerer's tread altered the surface. Faint impressions of boot soles appeared and disintegrated moments later, as though the corridor rejected the idea of retaining memory. Each disappearing footprint resonated with an uncomfortable familiarity. The faint glow at the end of the passage intensified. Its color fluctuated, at times pale as starlight washed of warmth, at others deep as submerged amethyst. The rhythm of its pulsing matched the desert's call. The air grew denser, pressing against the Sorcerer's armor in slow waves that corresponded to each shift in brightness. The psychic hum woven through the stone grew clearer, its frequency aligning itself with his presence in a way that resembled recognition. He entered a second chamber, smaller than the previous one but far more intricate. The walls curved into one another at soft angles, forming alcoves set with Eldar glyphs, whose lines drifted like mirages under unstable light. Some glyphs were deeply carved, others faintly etched, as if layered over centuries by differing hands. None remained fixed. Each symbol shifted with slow, fluid motion, maintaining coherence only long enough to hint at meaning before dissolving into new shapes. At the chamber's center lay a circular depression filled with sand that differed from that of the desert above. These grains shimmered with a faint luminescence, each particle holding a fragment of psychic memory. The pit was shallow, yet it seemed to hold a depth that pulled at the senses. The Dust Marines arranged themselves in a loose perimeter around it, their forms rigid and silent, as though awaiting a ritual they could neither understand nor refuse. The Sorcerer stepped toward the pit. At once, the chamber responded. The glyphs along the walls brightened, their shifting lines elongating and interlocking, forming a complex arrangement that bordered on comprehension. For a moment, just a moment, they indicated orientation, direction, intention. Then the pattern shattered, the glyphs returning to their erratic drift. The sands within the pit stirred, not by wind, not by vibration, but by memory. The surface rippled outward from the center, creating concentric rings that faded as quickly as they formed. Each ripple carried a faint psychic echo, a flicker of sensation that brushed against the sorcerer's awareness like fragments of a forgotten lesson. He felt the faintest touch of intellect in the motion, ancient and cautious, probing the edges of its own confinement. The walls contracted subtly, not physically, not in form but in perception. The chamber's boundaries shifted closer, narrowing his sense of space. Time stretched and compressed at uneven intervals, distorting the continuity of motion. The dust marines remained unmoved by these shifts, but their presence seemed to grow thinner, their forms merging into the surrounding gloom until they resembled silhouettes painted onto the air rather than objects occupying the room. The sorcerer lowered his staff toward the pit. The motion was deliberate, measured, and met without resistance. The sand responded immediately. A vortex spiraled upward, grains rising and falling in a looping pattern that suggested both invitation and caution. The vortex took form not a shape recognizable by mortal logic, but a configuration that carried structure, the beginning of meaning. The glyphs on the walls brightened again. Lines snapped into place, curves intersected. The patterns lasted longer this time, holding against the pull of dissolution. They hovered at the brink of language. The room held its breath. Then, abruptly, the configuration collapsed. The symbols reverted to their chaotic drift. The sand fell flat. But something remained, something beneath the surface, a deeper resonance. The sorcerer felt the presence. It was faint, yet immense, restrained, yet undeniable. It was not alive, at least not in a way that conformed to mortal definitions, but it possessed awareness. The awareness of a library that had outlived its creators. The awareness of an archive built to store what the universe could no longer contain. The awareness of knowledge severed from time, suspended in stasis, surviving not through endurance but through erasure. The presence pressed upward, seeking continuity. The sand rose in small peaks and ridges, aligning into new structures. Each shape lingered longer than the last, the patterns brushing the edge of comprehension. They carried elegance, precision, and sorrow, echoes of a civilization that had poured its memory into form only to watch time grind the edges away. The dust marines shifted again, a subtle movement, a response to something they could not perceive. Their armor creaked under the slightest shift in stance. Their empty helms faced the sandpit. The presence beneath the sand extended itself further. A faint pressure gathered around the sorcerer's hands and helm, like fingers tracing the contours of his thoughts. It felt neither hostile nor benevolent. It felt deliberate. The pit brightened. The glyphs rippled. A pulse surged through the chamber. Knowledge rose. Not in words, not in images, but in sensation. A 1,000-year memory of light. A fragment of lost architecture. A trace of weapon song. A shadow of astral pathways, a whisper of the moment before extinction. The sorcerer felt each impression brush across him like the edges of a torn manuscript, each fragment incomplete, each meaning slipping away before he could grasp it. He reached instinctively, not with hands, but with perception. The memory fragments recoiled, not away from him, but away from the world, as though the structure feared being known again. The pressure around him deepened. The presence recognized the shape of his soul. It recognized the flaw etched into him by the rubric. It recognized the hunger woven through every thousand sun who had survived the transformation. The sand surged upward. A column rose, particles aligning into an elaborate lattice. The lattice shifted, fracturing into multiple layers. Each layer rotated at a different angle, forming a complex geometric structure that shimmered with unstable energy. The sorcerer reached out. The structure dissolved at his touch. Sand rained back into the pit. The glyphs reverted to chaos. The presence withdrew, not out of weakness, but out of restraint. The chamber darkened. The dust marines froze. The sorcerer stood in the dim light, surrounded by shifting shadows and drifting grains. The library had spoken not in sound, but in silence. Its invitation was clear. Its boundaries were deliberate. It had acknowledged him, but it had not accepted him. Not yet. The pulse beneath the structure intensified once more, steady and patient, carrying the promise of deeper knowledge hidden behind further trials. The chamber's walls rippled, the boundaries blurring like reflections distorted by rippling water. The call had led him here. But this was only the threshold. The true depths waited beyond the reach of the first chamber. The Dust Marines turned their helms toward the far wall. There was more to uncover, more to endure, more to sacrifice. The library had opened its eyes, and it had not forgotten why it had closed them. The chamber's dimness recoiled from the lingering pulse, weaving back into crevices that folded upon themselves like retreating shadows. The structure seemed to inhale in a slow, ponderous rhythm, its boundaries swelling and contracting with imperceptible shifts in psychic pressure. The sorcerer felt each movement as a faint tightening across his armor's seals, a subtle pulling at the edges of his perception. The dust-filled air thickened with significance, though it held no scent, no texture, no temperature, only weight. The Dust Marines stood in absolute stillness around him, their armor catching the faint ripples of psychic glow skimming across the chamber walls. They resembled statues carved into the gloom, their metallic contours muted under the unstable lightning-like patterns sliding along the architecture. Their immobility gave the impression that they were no longer present in any true sense, absorbed into the structure as forgotten fragments of a forgotten war. Their emptiness formed a void the chamber seemed to lean toward, as if the absence of soul exerted its own gravity. The sorcerer stepped further into the chamber. The rune-lit alcoves brightened reflexively, responding to his presence. The glow did not carry warmth, if anything. It siphoned warmth away, drawing a chill through the air like the aftermath of extinguished flame. Patterns shimmered and reassembled in slow spirals, creating illusions of structure that threatened to solidify only to dissolve again. The glyphs resisted permanence, defying capture in a way that felt deliberate, as though they were living expressions of a mind that had refused to be fossilized by time. The center of the chamber shifted, not physically, not visibly, yet the sensation was undeniable. Space contracted around an unseen point, drawing the sorcerer's attention with irresistible pressure. A faint shimmer rose along the floor, grains of luminescent dust levitating in thin, wavering columns. These particles spiraled upward, forming narrow helixes that stretched halfway to the ceiling before collapsing inward. When they fell, they did not land, they merged into the stone as if absorbed by something beneath its surface. The sorcerer halted, adjusting the hold on his staff. The weapon thrummed with restrained agitation, its runes reacting to the disturbance with pulsing irritation. He felt the warp's faint murmur through its core, an echo of energies drawn toward the chamber's shifting pressure. The structure was aligning itself, not with him alone, but with something deeper, something rooted in memory, in ancient design, in a system of knowledge that operated outside of linear understanding. A fissure of light cracked across the far wall. The illumination that spilled through it was soft, diffuse, almost liquid in how it moved. It spilled downward in viscous layers, soaking into the ground where it pooled momentarily before thinning into pale tendrils that stretched toward the center of the room. These tendrils carried not warmth but sensation, an unspoken invitation laced with hesitation, urging approach while warning of the cost. The Dust Marines did not react. They never did. Yet the sorcerer sensed something shift in them, a faint tug, barely noticeable, like a string drawn taut within the hollow core of each armor. The warp binding that animated them vibrated faintly, resonating with the lattice of light now forming on the wall. They became extensions of the structure's intention, unmoving, unthinking, yet perfectly aligned with the rhythm of the chamber. The shifting light began to carve new glyphs across the stone. These symbols did not drift like those earlier, they formed decisively, each line etched with precision. Their clarity stood in stark contrast to the unstable patterns littering the rest of the room. These glyphs belonged to the heart of the library, uncorrupted by the erosion of centuries. They radiated a degree of coherence that made the sorcerer's breath catch beneath his armor, though he felt no physical change in airflow. The sense of comprehension hovered just beyond reach, pulling his awareness into a taut, uncomfortable silence. The light thickened, the glyphs pulsed, the air constricted. A low vibration permeated the chamber, spreading outward with the slow inevitability of encroaching tide. The sand within the shallow pit began to rise once more, this time with measured precision, forming an elegantly spiraled mound. Each grain glowed faintly, imprinting a pattern of movement into the collective structure. The mound swelled, collapsed, reshaped, collapsed again. The cycles grew faster, as if the sand was attempting to communicate, refining its expression with each iteration. Then, it halted. Lines formed across the surface, delicate, intricate patterns burned into the sand. The design resembled a map, a circuit, a thought. The outlines pulsed in silent rhythm, each breath of light stretching thinly across the room before withdrawing back into the structure. The patterns carried meaning. They were deliberately crafted, but as soon as comprehension neared, the lines dissolved. Sand fell, reformed, dissolved again. Knowledge struggled to exist. The sorcerer felt the strain keenly. It pressed against his mind like the edge of a knife running along the skull, not cutting flesh but parting thought. The presence beneath the sand pulsed once more, stronger this time, pushing the dust into sharp angles that nearly formed coherent glyphs before they collapsed into chaotic fragments. The structure was attempting communication and failing, not for lack of power, not for lack of intention, because something fundamental had been broken long ago. The chamber's ceiling flickered. Shadows curled downward, threading through the air like filament cut loose from a loom. They stretched toward the pit, converging around the rising sand. The particles lifted again, only slightly, but with a weight that suggested memory rising from the depths of stasis. The sorcerer advanced. The air hardened around him. The structure recognized his presence now. It acknowledged something in him, the stain of the rubric, the hunger for knowledge, the wound carved by a legion's failure. The connection deepened, and he felt as though he were descending through layers of meaning that grew heavier with each step. The sand formed a shape, a lattice, a construct of spiraling geometry so delicate it seemed woven from breath rather than matter. It trembled. It refined itself. It hovered in a fragile equilibrium. The sorcerer raised his hand toward it. The lattice dissolved instantly. Sand cascaded like falling ash, scattering across the pit in lifeless silence. The glyphs on the walls darkened. The air throbbed with muted disappointment, not emotional, but mechanical, like a mechanism recognizing misalignment. The structure withdrew slightly, not rejecting him, not accepting him, evaluating him. The dust marines remained statues at the perimeter, their presence a silent witness to the chamber's measured responses. They did not shift, they did not wilt, they simply existed, hollow vessels holding a semblance of identity through the will of a spell long broken. The sand stirred again, slower now. The resonance changed. A new pattern emerged. Not a glyph, not a lattice, a doorway. The lines traced themselves in the sand, forming an outline broad and tall enough for passage. The chamber dimmed as the pattern stabilized, drawing light inward with each pulse. The sorcerer felt the shift at once. This was not mere surface knowledge. This was an entrance to the deeper archive, where the true secrets of the library lay hidden. The doorway in the sand glowed. The glyphs aligned. The air sharpened. The structure awaited his approach. And somewhere beneath the floor, something older than the desert turned its attention toward him. The sorcerer stepped forward. The dust marines followed. The doorway opened, and the library exhaled its first breath in centuries. The doorway traced into the sand did not resemble a simple opening. It pulsed like a wound in the desert's skin, the edges glowing with a soft, internal luminescence that refused to disperse into the room. The shape held firm despite the unstable nature of the particles composing it, each grain maintaining its place as though bound by some residual will. The light radiating from within cast faint shadows along the chamber walls, stretching and retracting in irregular patterns that did not match the sorcerer's movements. The dust marines aligned themselves without instruction. Their hollow armor shifted by a fraction, angling toward the illuminated threshold with a coordinated precision that was neither instinctual nor commanded. Their presence formed a silent procession, standing in the dim glow as though awaiting a ritual they could neither understand nor resist. The runes along their pauldrons and greaves, once vibrant with psychic essence, now appeared muted, as if the structure's influence were draining what little residue lingered within them. The chamber trembled softly. The vibrations flowed through the floor, rising like a tide that carried weight but no motion. The dust in the air responded, gathering into faint ripples that spiraled upward in slow, deliberate arcs before dissolving. These ripples touched the sorcerer's armor, mapping the contours of his shape with an attentiveness that felt uncomfortably close to examination. The sensation lingered, brushing against the seams of his gauntlets and tracing the edges of his helm in a way that resembled touch, though it carried no physical pressure. He stepped forward, his staff angled slightly downward. The staff's runes vibrated, emitting a faint resonance like wind moving through hollow metal. The reaction was not defensive, it was anticipatory, as though the weapon itself recognized the threshold as something significant, something long expected. Its haft hummed in a rising, subtle pitch that rippled across his arm, embedding itself into the marrow beneath armor plates. The doorway shifted in response to his approach. Light curled inward, concentrating into a thin veil. Sand rearranged itself with quiet intention, forming a descending path that spiraled gradually into the floor. The boundaries of the room distorted, the ceiling stretching upward and blurring until it resembled a distant sky instead of a confined space. The structure expanded, not physically, but perceptually, as though peeling away layers of false geometry to reveal its truer form. The Dust Marines moved in unison, their steps soundless, their presence heavy in a way that defied their hollow state. They followed the sorcerer along the spiraling descent, their armor absorbing the glow from the shifting stones. Their shadows lengthened unnaturally across the curved walls, duplicating themselves at odd angles as if mirrored in surfaces that did not exist. The corridor ahead deepened into a smooth, downward slope, the material beneath their feet transitioning from stone to a substance resembling polished obsidian streaked with faint veins of silver-blue light. As they descended, the pressure in the air increased. Not physical pressure, psychic. The chamber below radiated expectation. At the base of the spiral, the path opened into a vast, circular chamber. This room dwarfed the previous ones. The walls were carved into sweeping arcs, each adorned with glyphs that glowed faintly, their lines drifting like veins in stone, constituted of memory instead of mineral. A shallow basin occupied the very center, filled not with sand but with a fine powder of shimmering motes, suspended above the surface like a cloud held captive by gravity. The air vibrated with a tone too low to be heard, a pressure that pressed lightly against the sorcerer's chest. The basin brightened. The motes rose and fell in synchronized waves, forming shapes that hovered in the space above shapes that resembled Eldar runes fractured into pieces. The patterns flickered erratically, trying to stabilize. The sorcerer watched them shift through dozens of configurations, each one crumbling before meaning could form. The structure was damaged, its memory fractured, its communication impaired, but it still sought connection. The Dust Marines stepped to the basin's edge. Their forms loomed over the motes, which responded by dimming for a moment, retreating from their empty presence. The cloud rippled outward, flowing away from them, as if recoiling from what they had become. The sorcerer felt the reaction like a cold draft brushing beneath his armor's seals. He understood then. The library was alive not in the organic sense, but in awareness. It recognized emptiness. It recognized hollowness. It recognized the wrongness of what stood before it, and it required something more. The motes began to gather into a new formation, swirling into a latticework of symbols that formed a cohesive ring. This ring hovered directly above the basin. The sorcerer observed the light coalesce inward, forming a nexus that pulsed like a beating heart attempting to remember its rhythm. The glyphs in the ring faded in and out, their edges fraying in patterns that suggested incomplete memory. The price became clear. The presence beneath the sand had evaluated the sorcerer. It had examined the Dust Marines, and it had decided what must be given. The runes along the chamber walls brightened sharply, casting thin beams of pale light toward the basin. The beams converged along the edges of the ring, illuminating the sorcerer's form in brief waves. The light reflected off the hollow helms of the Dust Marines, catching empty eye lenses that flickered with transient sparks of energy, echoes of the souls that once inhabited them. A faint vibration enveloped the chamber. The Dust Marines trembled, not physically, but in essence. Their warp binding weakened. Something was pulling at them, not violently, delicately. The sorcerer sensed the shift instantly. The library was testing them, probing the boundary of their existence, noting the absence of consciousness. Then, the motes rose all at once. A cloud of luminescence surged upward from the basin, spiraling around the dust marines in a slow, circling pattern. The glow slipped along their armor, tracing the joints and seams, peeling back the thin psychic residue that tethered them to motion. Their armor dimmed further, the faint shimmer of warp energy flickering like a candle on the verge of extinguishing. The sorcerer watched, unmoving. He did not intervene. The process was careful, methodical. The library drew closer to understanding. The motes flowed inward. They entered the dust marine's armor through the smallest of gaps. They moved through the hollowness inside, carrying with them the faint warmth of memory, and the armor sagged, just barely, as if the absence within had deepened. The process continued. The mote cloud brightened. The dust marines dimmed. The price was becoming clearer with every heartbeat. This library did not open without cost. It required essence. It required presence. It required soul. And the dust marines possessed only the faintest echo of one. A residue. A fragile imprint. A trace of memory that the rubric had failed to erase completely. The motes reached deeper. Armor groaned softly metal under the weight of unraveling enchantment. A spell cast centuries ago flickered, pulling thin. The hollow warriors leaned slightly, as if dragged forward by a force that demanded tribute. The sorcerer felt the strain in the bindings. He sensed the rubric's remnants fray like old cloth. He sensed the library's evaluation. The price was not coin, not knowledge, but spirit, sacrifice. For entry, a cold certainty settled into the air. The library had chosen its requirement, and the dust marines would pay it, whether he willed it or not. The chamber's light condensed into a single, thin vibration that skated across the surface of the basin. The motes that circled the dust marines pulsed in unison, brightening with unnatural intensity before dimming again to a near-invisible shimmer. The rhythm of the motion was neither random nor predictable. It followed a pattern the sorcerer recognized instinctively, a calculation, a measurement, the first stage of a ritual that did not require incantation. The ground beneath the basin shifted. The floor did not tremble. Instead, the material changed density, becoming less like stone and more like a surface stretched across a void. The air around it thickened, concentrating into static pressure that clung to the sorcerer's joints like magnetized dust. Each inhalation tightened beneath his armor, though no airflow penetrated the helm. The sensation was not physical. It was metaphysical, a pressing awareness of boundaries weakening. The dust marines leaned forward under an unseen weight. Their armor tilted fractionally, as though compelled by gravity more intent than natural. The runes etched into their pauldrons flickered, their faint glow swallowed by the motes now fully embedded within the hollow shells of their forms. The cloud of shimmering particles moved through their bodies with slow deliberation, tracing old patterns, following psychic scars where soul had once resided. The basin brightened again, not with flame, not with heat, but with memory. The light rose from within the shallow depression like a liquid sheet being lifted by invisible hands. It spread across the chamber, clinging to the walls, revealing layers of architecture that had been dormant. The glyphs carved into the stone aligned themselves momentarily, forming fractured sequences that nearly resolved into coherent language before the instability of time's erosion broke the pattern apart. The sorcerer stepped closer. The light deepened, forming a ring around the basin. Not a simple circle, but a glyphic boundary woven from strands of luminescence. Each strand vibrated independently, its frequency shifting in accordance with the dust marine's hollow presence. They were the center of the ritual's attention. Their emptiness was the key. Their absence was the offering. The sorcerer felt the tension within them. Warp-binding threads loosened around their frames, stretching like strands of aged sinew. The spell that animated them the last trace of who they had been strained audibly. Armor groaned under the stress, joints grinding softly as though resisting a force intent on unraveling what little remained tethered to existence. The basin's motes surged. A wave of light expanded outward, engulfing the first rank of dust marines. Their armor stiffened, their limbs locked at unnatural angles as the shimmering essence moved through them with surgical precision. The threads of warp binding pulled taut, trembling with the effort of retaining cohesion. Something gave. The sound was soft, a whisper of metal losing purpose. The sorcerer watched as a faint trail of essence rose from the hollow frame. It resembled smoke at first glance, but thicker, more substantial, carrying the faintest impression of color and emotion. Not the soul itself, those had been sealed or destroyed long ago, but the imprint that once held it. The echo, the residue. The library claimed it. The shimmering trail drifted into the basin, absorbed instantly into the roiling field of motes. The basin brightened violently, the light sharpening into a blade-like glare before collapsing inward. The glyphs on the walls surged with matching intensity, aligning into sharp angles that pulsed along the chamber's circumference. A second dust marine followed. His essence, what remained of it, peeled away with slightly greater resistance. The warp binding strained, threads snapping in slow, deliberate unraveling. The armor sagged as the shell emptied further, its weight shifting with the sound of internal collapse. The cloud of motes responded with hunger, spiraling inward, devouring the fading core with quiet reverence. One by one, the dust marines began to break, not dramatically, not violently, but with the softness of old parchment crumbling between fingers. Their rigid forms softened at the edges, their outlines blurring, their shadows thinning, their joints buckling under the collapse of what little vitality supported them. The sorcerer felt each collapse like a cold wind brushing the edges of memory. These had once been brothers, companions in ritual, scholars, warriors, sons of a broken father. Now they were sacrifices, unwilling, unknowing, yet inevitable. The library demanded their residue. It needed the faint spark that clung to their hollowness. It needed the echo of the rubric's failure. It needed what the sorcerer could not give, the fragment of self still buried inside each empty vessel. The basin reacted to each offering. Its light grew sharper, more defined. The sand at its edges lifted into geometric spirals that interlocked, forming a rotating ring. This ring hovered above the basin, spinning slowly, shedding thin ribbons of luminescent dust that spread across the floor like veins of molten metal. The glyphs on the walls synchronized. The entire chamber resonated with precise, deliberate vibration, not chaotic, not fragmented, coherent. Knowledge was waking. The library was beginning to remember, but the price was not yet paid. More dust marines leaned forward under the beckoning influence. The warp binding anchoring them stretched thinner. Threads snapped soundlessly. Their armor emptied further. Essence rose like faint vapors from each hollow form. The basin pulled them in. The motes devoured them. The glyphs brightened. The sorcerer felt the pressure rising. The chamber thickened with psychic weight, compressing time into jagged intervals. His armor's runes pulsed erratically, responding to the shifts with frantic fluctuations of light. His staff vibrated in steady sympathy, the warp within it resonating with the structure's awakening. One dust marine collapsed entirely. His armor crumpled in on itself, folding with metallic resignation. The last of his essence drifted toward the basin like dust caught in a beam of muted sunlight. It was absorbed instantly. The light intensified. Another fell, then another. A cascade of hollow shells giving up what little remained of the souls they once held. The library pulsed. A deep, resonant thrum echoed through the chamber. The basin glowed with fierce clarity. The spiraling ring accelerated. Glyphs snapped into recognizable sequences. The sorcerer felt comprehension brushing his mind, a hint of meaning, a shape of understanding, a whisper of knowledge. Then it recoiled, not failing, not collapsing, withholding. The price was not fully paid. Only one dust marine remained intact. The others lay collapsed, empty armor forming a silent ring around the basin. The final warrior's frame trembled under the weight of unraveling spellwork. The warp binding flickered dangerously. His essence, a faint sliver, quivered within the empty chest cavity. The basin reached for it. The sorcerer stood motionless. The last hollow shell inched closer to collapse. Essence rose slowly, a fragile wisp of memory. barely more than nothing. Yet everything the library required. The moats brightened, the basin pulsed, the glyphs aligned. The last essence drifted free. The basin devoured it. Light erupted from the center. The spiraling ring fractured, expanding outward into a radiant lattice that reached toward the ceiling. Glyphs solidified, forming a coherent sequence for the first time. The chamber's architecture unfolded like a flower blooming from stone. The price had been paid. The gate of unmaking opened, and the true archive began to awaken. The chamber held its breath after the last shell collapsed, as if the space itself adjusted to the absence left behind. The air no longer vibrated with the faint tension of struggling warp binding. The hollow armor pieces lay in a ring around the basin, arranged by accident yet resembling a ritual circle prepared through deliberate design. Their emptiness thickened the atmosphere rather than thinning it, the presence of so many absences creating a sensation of depth that pulled downward through the floor. The sorcerer stepped forward. The light rising from the basin folded inward, condensing into a narrow column that extended toward the far wall. The stone reacted immediately, its surface rippling as though it were membrane rather than solid. Lines emerged from within the material, faint grooves tracing uncertain patterns that sharpened into a vertical seam. The seam spread open with silent pressure until it extended from floor to ceiling, revealing a space beyond that pulsed with dim, undulating light. He crossed the threshold. The passage beyond was narrow, barely wider than his armored frame. The walls curved inward, their surface smooth but subtly shifting beneath the pressure of unseen forces. The light, thin and colorless, did not emanate from any single point. Instead, it filled the corridor in uneven layers, creating gradients that expanded and contracted with slow, irregular rhythm. The effect was disorienting. The sensation of motion did not match his steps. His body advanced, but the environment flowed around him as though sliding in the opposite direction. His armor felt heavier. Not physically, its mass had not changed, but the psychic weight of the place pressed downward, as though attempting to anchor him to each moment he passed through. Every step deepened the pressure, not enough to impede movement, but enough to grind a subtle ache into the joints of his armor. His staff absorbed some of the strain, the runes etched into it fluttering with erratic pulses. They were not resisting, they were adjusting to a presence older than their forging. The corridor narrowed further, compressing space into a tighter path. The walls remained out of reach, barely but close enough that the air between them thickened into a palpable force. The atmosphere carried neither heat nor cold, neither scent nor texture. It simply existed with oppressive density, a boundary without form that pressed into the spaces between armor plating. The floor shifted intermittently, not visibly, but perceptibly. Each step landed with a sensation of momentary misalignment, as though the surface redefined itself at the exact instant weight touched it. The effect made time stutter in the warp sense, compressing and elongating intervals without rhythm. His senses adjusted reluctantly, guided by centuries of training and adaptation to environments shaped by psychic forces. The passage began to incline downward, not steeply but steadily. The pressure increased with each meter, layering upon itself until movement felt like wading through deep, invisible fluid. The corridor twisted subtly at first, then with deliberate complexity. The turn was not sharp. The path curved like a thought reshaping itself, bending inward toward a destination that refused linear logic. The light dimmed, not fading, densifying. Its absence pressed closer than its presence had. Shadows accumulated without edges, pooling along the lower portions of the walls and stretching upward like elongated impressions rather than actual silhouettes. Their movement lagged behind his own, trailing with slight delay. The effect suggested residue rather than reflection, the corridor imprinting traces of his passage as it shifted around him. He advanced deeper. The pressure focused around his helm, pressing across the front, sides, and crown with equal force. It felt like hands devoid of shape tracing the boundaries of his awareness, not to restrain but to evaluate. The sensation carried neither malice nor curiosity. It resembled protocol, a scanning of presence rather than identity. The corridor widened abruptly. Not enough to create space, only enough to permit a breath that did not exist in truth. He felt the shift like a faint expansion in the chest plate, a minor loosening of the invisible pressure. The path ahead sloped downward more sharply, and the walls leaned inward, forming a funnel-shaped descent leading toward a deeper chamber. The sorcerer continued, guided not by sight, but by the faint pull emanating from beyond the narrowing floor. His staff vibrated with subtle certainty, the warp-bound core resonating with frequencies that matched those pulsing through the passage. His steps carried no sound. The silence in the corridor swallowed even the friction of metal on stone. He reached the base of the slope. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the earlier ones, yet suffocating in its density. The air felt stratified, layers of psychic pressure stacked atop one another. Movement became more deliberate, each step pressing through subtle resistance. The floor was smooth and featureless, devoid of dust or debris. The walls curved upward, narrowing into a dome that flickered with faint, unstable illumination. At the center of the chamber lay a circular indentation, not a basin, not a pit, an impression, as though something immense had once rested there. Not recently, but long enough ago that the room had reshaped itself around the memory of its absence. The indentation pulsed, not visually, psychically, a rhythm of emptiness, a hollow echo vibrating through the space like a low, distant thrum. The sorcerer approached. The pressure increased, focusing around his torso and helm. His armor creaked faintly under the strain, not from structural stress but from the psychic weight bearing down upon it. His joints resisted movement for a moment before adjusting, aligning themselves with the chamber's rhythm. The center pulsed again. A faint shimmer rose from the indentation, thin as vapor and colorless as void. It moved upward in slow, looping spirals, winding around itself before dispersing into the dome above. The movement resembled breath without body, memory without origin. The pressure deepened. A sensation brushed against the surface of his consciousness, a suggestion, not a message, a pull, not a command. He stepped into the indentation. The chamber reacted instantly, the walls constricted by imperceptible degrees, closing inward, not physically but in relevance. The dome flickered, shadows tightened along its curves. The floor beneath him softened in sensation, though not in form. The impression beneath his boots responded like something that had once been alive, adjusting to the weight it no longer recognized. The pressure concentrated around his helm, not invasive, evaluative, not hostile, methodical, not probing, measuring. The chamber assessed him, his presence, his essence. The floor carved into him by the rubric, the hunger woven through every sorcerer that survived it, the echo of brotherhood lost, the residue of knowledge sought beyond reason. The pressure intensified until movement became nearly impossible. The chamber inhaled, then exhaled. The floor beneath him opened, not mechanically, not destructively. It simply ceased to be surface. Gravity inverted in sensation but not direction. The descent was neither falling nor sinking. It resembled being drawn downward through stillness, guided by an unseen current that held him in perfect alignment. The chamber folded upward. The passage closed. Shadows merged. He descended into a space where the concept of descent held no meaning, into a hollow that awaited the next offering, into a depth carved from silence, into a void that knew him before he arrived. The descent ended without impact, without shift, without any indication that movement had ceased. One moment the sorcerer felt the pull of downward drift. The next he stood upon a surface so still and unyielding that it seemed less like stone and more like a concept given form. The air around him held no temperature, no movement, no scent, only a dense neutrality that pressed against his armor with patient, unwavering weight. The space was wide, though its boundaries were unclear. The dim light that filtered through the air behaved less like illumination and more like memory recalling the idea of sight. The walls, if walls existed, remained out of reach, hinted at only by faint gradients of shadow that shifted with no correlation to his movements. This was not a room shaped by architecture. It was a vault, sculpted by intention. An interior of the library where shape obeyed meaning rather than physics. Beneath his boots, the floor responded to his presence. It did not move or flex, but the sensation of standing shifted subtly, as though the vault recognized a weight unfamiliar to it. Every fraction of pressure created an echo through the structure, a psychic ripple that traveled outward, seeking context in a space that had forgotten the nature of those who once walked here. His staff steadied him, though its runes fluttered between bursts of vibrant pulse and near-dormant flicker. The vault's presence seeped into the weapon through the air, tracing the warp-edged sigils with faint, probing currents. The sensation resembled cold fingertips brushing across a surface coated with dust older than memory, searching for the remnants of purpose. The sorcerer advanced, and the vault answered. The light dimmed, then concentrated behind him, nudging his perception forward. The floor's texture shifted beneath each step, never enough to change traction, only enough to remind him that movement here was not fully his own. The vault guided him along a path that did not exist until he walked it. The pressure intensified around the contours of his helm. It was not suffocating, but insistently present, as though the vault pressed inward to determine the boundaries of his awareness. He felt the sensation along the edges of his mind, a slow, tightening pressure that resembled the closing of a distant hand around unseen fabric. A faint distortion appeared ahead, not a doorway, not an arch, merely a region of space where the air thickened into visible density. Its edges wavered with quiet vibration, like heat distorting the horizon, though no warmth emanated from it. The distortion drew him closer with gentle inevitability, the vault shaping itself around the path he had already chosen. As he approached, the distortion expanded, revealing something within it, fractured slivers of imagery suspended like shards of glass in liquid. Each shard flickered with suggestions of scenes, the outline of a soaring structure, a blurred silhouette of a figure in crystalline armor, a burst of starfire reflected across a curved surface. None remained stable long enough to identify. They were not memories. They were scars. The vault contained them not as recollections but as fractures in the idea of what once was. He stepped through the distortion. The air thickened, and the vault reshaped itself. The ground dipped subtly, forming a shallow descent into a wider expanse. The floor took on the faint grit of powdered crystal, which clung to the edges of his boots but made no sound underfoot. The lights above or below, or around, shifted into pale bands of muted color that pulsed with fragmented rhythm. The pulses did not form a pattern. They flickered in broken cadence, the vault attempting to reconstruct something it could not fully remember. To his left, space folded. A section of the vault rippled inward, revealing the suggestion of a collapsed structure embedded within the wall. It was not a ruin in the physical sense. It was an impression of collapse, as though the vault held the idea of a fallen archway without possessing the archway itself. The sensory weight of destruction pressed into the air, a remnant of something long erased yet still felt. To his right, fragments of runes floated in suspended arcs. They were incomplete, each missing strokes and curves essential to meaning. They rotated in slow, spiraling paths, shifting direction whenever his gaze brushed across them. Their presence carried a faint pressure, a reminder of knowledge severed from completion. The vault thickened in meaning as he approached its center. The air tightened further. The floor pressed upward with the weight of expectation. The light concentrated into a pool ahead, gathered into a pale illumination that pulsed with slow, heavy rhythm. Within that pool lay something that resisted form, a mass of shifting, warping patterns that resembled glyphs attempting to become words, ideas attempting to become shape, memories attempting to become images. The patterns folded into themselves repeatedly, collapsing at the moment they neared coherence. It was not indecision, it was damage. The vault had lost the ability to hold meaning fully. It grasped fragments, repeating them in endless, futile reconstruction. The sorcerer approached. The vault felt his presence more acutely. Pressure constricted around him with renewed precision, mapping the contours of his mind with deliberate calculation. The sensation resembled the tightening of a psychic coil, each loop drawing closer but never fully closing. The instability of the patterns intensified as he neared the pool. Glyphs warped faster. Shadows thickened along the edges of the vault. The air throbbed with faint pulses that pushed against the inside of his helm. The vault recognized something within him. The flaw left by the rubric, the wound carved into every survivor, the hunger for knowledge that persisted even after the price had been made clear. The pool brightened, the patterns convulsed. A low vibration shuddered through the floor, carrying with it a sensation of awakening. Not the awakening of life, not the awakening of consciousness. The awakening of function. The vault attempted communication, not with sound, nor image, nor constructed meaning. It used pressure, sensation, memory of sensation. A hollow ache rose in the air, familiar, heavy. The echo of loss. The vault mirrored the shape of emptiness that lingered in every dust marine who had been sacrificed. It projected the sensation outward, letting it brush against the sorcerer's mind with the tenderness of someone handling a fragile object. The ache deepened, pulling at the edges of thought. The vault shaped another sensation, not loss, transition. The shift between form and unform. The moment a soul becomes residue, the moment the residue becomes offering. He felt the faint ripple of what his brothers had become. The vault reproduced their unmaking as a memory of pressure, not accusation, not lament, context. The patterns within the pool collapsed utterly. For a moment the light died, leaving the vault in near total dimness. Then the floor surged upward with a bright, blinding pulse that washed across the chamber like a silent shockwave. The patterns reformed, coherent this time, sharp, angular, old. They hovered in perfect arrangement above the center of the vault, bound together by the echo of souls consumed. The vault had remembered. The pressure dissolved into stillness. The light dimmed to an even glow. A path formed ahead, straight, narrow, unwavering. The vault opened itself. It had received its price, and now it would reveal what remained of its truth. The path ahead stretched without visible beginning or end, an extension of the vault that had chosen shape only because he continued to move forward. Each step pressed into a surface that did not fully solidify, carrying the sensation of descending through layers of memory rather than traversing a floor. The air around him no longer vibrated with pressure. It held the quiet of a sealed chamber in which nothing living had breathed for centuries. That stillness was not empty. It was dense, almost physical, like the atmosphere surrounding a relic preserved beneath layers of ritual and time. The light along the corridor flickered, not in pulses but in slow expansions of dim illumination that clung to his armor before retreating back into the walls. No source of brightness existed. The glow rose from the space itself, like the echo of thoughts attempting to manifest. The corridor narrowed with each meter he walked, though not visibly. The sense of space contracted around him, pressing the air into tighter boundaries until the motion of moving forward resembled pushing through invisible layers. His armor absorbed the pressure without complaint, but he felt the strain in the subtle stiffness of each joint, in the slight hesitation his limbs took before completing a step. The vault's memory clung to him, not as information, but as sensation. The echo of fractured glyphs pressed against his mind in soft pulses, like ripples spreading across a surface too deep to see. The language they tried to form pushed outward in incomplete fragments that dissolved before they could reach coherence. They touched the edges of comprehension, then retreated, leaving behind only the faint suggestion of meaning. The corridor opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the previous spaces, though the boundaries remained undefined. The walls curved in gentle arcs that bent inward, as though attempting to embrace the chamber's center. The floor sank by a shallow degree, creating a basin-like depression that held a faint fog of shimmering particulate, suspended just above the ground in slow, drifting patterns. The fog was not mist. It behaved like the residue of thought, a collection of fragmented impressions searching for form. As he stepped into the basin, the fog responded immediately, rising in a thin spiral that wound itself around his frame. The particles drifted along the edges of his armor, tracing faint, trembling lines that resembled glyphs failing to stabilize. They hovered, flickered, collapsed, then reformed in new arrangements. The vault was trying to speak, but its voice had been shattered. The fog thickened, condensing into a broad arc that curved around him. The arc pulsed lightly with uneven light, reflecting the vault's fractured recollection. Shapes emerged within it, blurry, unstable silhouettes that shifted through multiple forms before dissolving. A towering structure, A crystalline archway, a figure robed in light, a blade of shimmering energy, a room filled with floating tomes, a circle of silent watchers. Each image crumbled under its own weight, unable to hold the integrity needed to exist. The impressions were not incomplete, they were breaking. Time had not faded them, catastrophe had shattered them. He stood unmoving as the vault continued its attempt. The fog spread across the basin, arranging itself into patterns that pulsed with growing urgency. The vault sought to recover what it had once known. Not for him, he understood that much. It was remembering for itself, reciting fragments of knowledge that had been locked beneath the sands, sealed away in ritual that even time could not fully claim. The light within the fog sharpened. A lattice of pale brilliance formed above the basin, rotating slowly. The lattice resembled the geometric structure he had seen earlier, delicate, symmetrical, beautiful in its precision, but this version flickered violently, fragments missing from its edges. The vault struggled to stabilize it. Threads of light extended toward the walls, grasping at glyphs that refused to remain fixed. Thin cracks of brightness crawled across the chamber, tracing veins of fading memory. The sorcerer watched in silence. He felt the pull of the glyphs as they attempted to connect with him. They recognized the imprint of the rubric. They recognized the hunger carried by all thousand sons who still sought meaning amid the wreckage of what their legion had become. They pressed against his awareness, seeking anchoring, but the vault's memory was too damaged. The lattice collapsed, the fog scattered. Light fractured into splinters that drifted aimlessly before dissolving into nothing. The chamber fell still, not silent still, stillness that carried the weight of something ancient, realizing it could no longer recall its own purpose. The vault dimmed, not fully, but noticeably. The light sank into the walls, retracting into small pockets of pale luminescence that throbbed with exhausted rhythm. The fog settled into a thin layer near the floor, drifting without pattern. A subtle pressure filled the chamber, a soft ache, an echo of the vault's recognition of its own brokenness. Then the fog rose again, slowly this time. Carefully, it gathered in thin strands that twisted upward like the arms of something reaching for stability. The strands braided themselves into a spiral column that hovered before him. This time the vault attempted a different approach, not memory, meaning. The column throbbed with low, steady pulses. Each pulse flowed outward in concentric waves that pressed against the edges of his mind with deliberate weight. Knowledge seeped through the pressure, wordless, imageless, sensation-based. It conveyed the concept of preservation, the memory of loss, the effort to hold what could not be held, the moment of shattering, the failure of containment, the sorrow of erasure. The vault did not convey events, it conveyed the emotional shape of events. The psychic echo of trauma that had carved emptiness into its core. The pulses intensified. They spread across his awareness like heat moving through cold metal, carrying fragments of intention that sought resonance with something within him. They brushed against the wound left by the rubric, the fissure carved into his essence by a spell meant to save but destined to destroy. The vault recognized that wound. It recognized the shape of it. It recognized the echo of its own brokenness in him, and it tried once more. The fog thickened, shaping itself into a second column. The pressure doubled. Sensations pressed into him, the weight of knowledge attempting to be held, the collapse of meaning under strain, the failure of ritual, the cracking of a seal, the impossibility of preservation. The moment time tore through the archive like a blade. The vault forced the sensations together. They intertwined. They sharpened, meaning nearly formed. He felt it on the edge of comprehension. The shape of a secret, the outline of forbidden truth, the answer that lay beneath centuries of buried ruin. Then the vault lost hold. The light spasmed, the fog collapsed, the meaning unraveled. All knowledge dissolved into blankness. Not forgotten, erased by the very structure meant to preserve it. The ache in the chamber deepened. The vault's failure settled like dust across the floor, covering the basin in a thin, shimmering layer of resignation. The sorcerer felt the echo of that failure reverberate through him. This was the truth of the library. Knowledge here could be reached, but not retained, understood, but not held, revealed, but not survived. The vault pulsed one final time. A faint path opened on the far side of the chamber, not illuminated, not carved, merely revealed, a narrow way into the final depth. The vault had given all it could. What remained lay ahead. Knowledge that could not stay waited there, and he stepped toward it without hesitation, feeling the vault close behind him like a thought finally forced into silence. The final passage narrowed into a long, subtle curve that bent inward like the interior of a spiraling shell. The air thickened as the sorcerer advanced, forming layers of resistance that pressed against him with quiet insistence. Every step pushed through increments of invisible mass that clung to the joints of his armor and slowed the motion of his limbs. The vault no longer felt like a place constructed by ancient hands, but a mind attempting to remember itself through the presence of an intruder. The dim glow that had accompanied him through the previous chambers faded entirely. The darkness that replaced it did not resemble absence. It felt more like the unformed quiet beneath perception, the blank page before memory finds its ink. The pressure around him intensified as though the air sought to bind him in place, but the passage continued to pull him deeper. The floor vanished, not physically, but perceptively. His steps no longer made contact with anything tangible. Movement persisted only because the vault permitted it. The space ahead brightened, not with light, but with the suggestion of illumination, a pale presence that filled the passage without producing glow. It emerged gradually, like the surface of deep fog pulling forward to meet him. The boundaries dissolved, and the curve of the passage unraveled into a chamber unlike any he had entered before. It was vast, but the vastness held no shape. It was bright, but no source of brightness existed. It was empty, but its emptiness pressed against him with the weight of a living presence. The white expanse had no floor, no ceiling, no walls. It had only density, thick, uniform, unbroken, a blank sanctum carved from the memory of what once existed. The sorcerer stepped into it without noticing the instant his feet left the passage behind. The vault closed behind him without sound, sealing itself like a thought withdrawn from awareness. He stood alone within a space that resisted dimension. His armor cast no shadow. His form seemed suspended in a medium that defied distance. No echo followed his steps. The sanctum devoured every trace of motion before it could imprint itself. The white expanse pulsed, not visibly, but within the deeper folds of perception. The sanctum recognized him. It pressed gently against his awareness, brushing the edges of thought with movements so soft they resembled drifting fabric. These movements probed the texture of his mind, tracing the imprint of the rubric, the hollowed residue of sacrifice, the hunger for certainty etched into every survivor of Prospero's fall. The sanctum responded. A ripple formed across the whiteness, thin as breath, carrying the weight of intention. The ripple shaped itself into faint lines, barely visible strokes that hovered in front of him. They resembled runes, but incomplete, their edges dissolving as soon as they tried to anchor into shape. The sanctum attempted communication in the language of its creators, but that language no longer held together within this fractured space. The lines folded inward. They broke. White dust collected around the collapsing glyphs, drifting away as if dismissed by the vault itself. The sanctum adjusted. A second ripple emerged, forming a different pattern, not runes, structures, the faint outline of a chamber, a tall arch, a circle of floating crystals, a figure standing at their center. The image flickered violently before breaking apart. The sanctum retrieved another memory fragment and tried again. Each attempt dissolved as swiftly as it formed. The sanctum could not show him what it had once held, but it could show him the sensation of what remained. Pressure deepened. The white expanse thickened, its density contracting around his form like the slow closing of an unseen hand. The sanctum shifted from image to sensation, projecting the weight of forbidden knowledge with the immediacy of heat pressed against metal. A surge of clarity pierced the blankness. Not vision understanding, a shape of meaning formed without symbols, a truth expressed through sensation rather than language. He felt the moment the Eldar had realized their archive could not be saved. The trembling instability of the vault's deepest layers, the psychic shattering of glyphs as reality distorted, the collapse of structures built to hold knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, the decision made without words. Only necessity, to seal the archive, to bury it beneath desert and time, to let memory fade rather than seed disaster. The sanctum pressed harder, and another understanding followed. The knowledge here was not lost, it was locked away by design. Not to protect the Eldar alone, to protect reality. What the archive contained had been too dangerous to preserve, too powerful to destroy, too malformed to repair. So it had been sealed inside a sanctum without form, a space where meaning dissolved and memory decayed before it could be grasped. Only sensation remained, only echoes, only the emotional shapes of truths too heavy for structured language. The sanctum tightened further, the pressure sharpened into a narrow band that focused along the edges of his mind, pressing inward with steady, unyielding pressure. It resembled the sensation of being lowered into a depth without light, the pressure of deep ocean crushing the contours of the body. The sanctum was revealing the shape of the truth through weight instead of words. A final ripple formed. This one did not attempt to construct images. It pressed into his awareness directly, shaping meaning through sensation. Knowledge was not meant to be held. Knowledge was meant to pass through. The more he sought to grasp, the faster it unraveled. The sanctum allowed him to understand this not through teaching, but through force. The pressure increased until the whiteness blurred. His armor felt distant, his body felt hollow. The edges of self thinned under the weight of meaning he was not meant to carry. The sanctum showed him the truth of his legion. Their hunger mirrored this vault's fracture. Their curse reflected this sanctum's design. They were drawn to knowledge that refused to remain, compelled to pursue meaning that unraveled when held. Their fate was the echo of this archive's failure, a parallel shaped by tragedy and sealed by consequence. Another ripple struck, a burst of weight pressed outward, not at him but through him. The sanctum attempted to give him one final truth, one last shape of understanding. It reached the edge of coherence, it neared clarity, it brushed the boundary of revelation and collapsed. Everything dissolved. The whiteness fell inward like dust scattering from a broken vase. Pressure vanished, meaning vanished. Everything the sanctum tried to reveal evaporated before comprehension solidified. The space around him dimmed, its density fading into hollow quiet. The sanctum no longer attempted communication. It had reached its limit. The truth had been too large even for the vault to contain. The white expanse remained silent. The sorcerer stood alone within the fading brightness, feeling the last fragments of knowledge dissolve inside him like sand slipping through an open hand. Nothing remained. No memory, no insight. Only the echo of something he had almost understood. The passage reopened behind him. The vault released him. The sanctum exhaled, and he stepped out carrying nothing but the weight of what could not be kept, a fitting end for a son of Prospero.